In a society where even the most cartoony of video games, like Fortnite, are based entirely around the goal of killing others, it's easy to see why violent media is a concern among many parents and psychologists. There have been many studies, but the results are hard to decipher. Is a correlation between violent video games and violent children proven, or is it just a wives' tale? Could we all benefit from putting down the Call of Duty? Watch this video to find out. Hello everyone, and welcome to another Fireside Chat. Today's topic is somewhat of a controversial one in the gaming community: the effects of violent video games on gamers, specifically children. This has been a concern for years, but a growing one now as violent video games become more popular in general, but also more popular among today's youth. Children as young as 5 can be found bragging about their kill streaks in Call of Duty Black Ops 4. Of course, this begs the question, is all this really healthy? I mean, not only for players as a whole, but for young children. Despite the numerous scientific studies done on the subject, few come to any solid conclusions about the negative effects of violent gaming. Each psychologist disagrees with the next one. But with some effort, several Psychology Today articles, and more than a few cups of coffee, I've managed to sift through the data and come up with the most solid answer possible, at least until more research is done on the subject. The answer is, drumroll please, no. Or at least, not entirely. So where's the proof? In a study done by a group of German researchers, it was found that violent video games have no long-term effect on empathy and aggression. The study, published in Frontiers in Psychology, focused on males, who more frequently play that video game genre, who played first-person shooters for at least 2 hours a day. Before testing, they took at least a 3-hour break from gaming to test long-term, not immediate, results of violent video games. They then took a questionnaire gauging aggression and ability to empathize, and no difference was found between those who played no video games and those who played violent video games. Additionally, an fMRI was taken of them while exposed to emotionally charged images, and the gamers showed no difference in brain activity than the non-gamers. The result? They came to the conclusion that violent video games have no lasting effect on a gamer's aggression or ability to empathize with others. In fact, another study found that as video game consumption increases, there has been a decrease in crime. This could very well be a coincidence, but it could also show an important connection. Do aggressive and violent video games actually provide a release of negative energy rather than generating it? This is definitely a possibility to think about, at least until more studies are done. So, that means we're scot-free then, right? We can just play all the CSGO and Call of Duty we want? Well, not exactly. What these findings don't address is the short-term effects of these type of video games. Anyone who's played any online game before has experienced the wild toxicity of many competitive gamers. A loss is more than a loss. It's utterly soul-crushing, and it's never their fault either. Any bad play or any mistake brings you loads of insults, badgering, and sometimes even threats. On some occasions, these types of encounters can leave you feeling afraid afterwards, especially if your game account has any personal data on it. Their rage leaves you wondering what they would really do if they met you in real life. Some gamers smash their keyboards or mouses when they lose or make a misstep, sometimes even breaking their hardware. All this seems rather ridiculous for a video game, doesn't it? We're not going to get into that entirely right now. If you want to see more, go watch my Rage Fireside Chat. But the overall takeaway is that despite the lack of lasting effect, video games in general, but especially violent video games, can cause short-term aggressive behavior. Think about it, there's more toxicity in games like Fortnite, Overwatch, CSGO, and Call of Duty than something less aggressive and less violent, like Overcooked or FIFA. Now, I know many gamers scoff at the idea of violent video games affecting aggression and ability to empathize with others, but there is valid reason for worry. There have been many scientific studies that prove a correlation between violent video games and real-life violence and aggression. So many, in fact, that the American Psychological Association, or APA for short, released a statement noting the correlation between violent video games and, I quote, acts of mass homicide. The whole release also discusses many other negative consequences of violent video games, on both mood and the psyche as a whole. I know what you're thinking. Then how could you say that violent video games have no long-term effects? Well, there's a couple things that falsify the results of this conclusion. First of all, there's a lot of bias in this area. There's a lot of social stigma among parents, and they want to hear that violent video games are bad for children. This is what psychologists often favor also, so studies saying that violent video games are bad are more likely to get published. Additionally, there's been a study that shows that video game behavioral experiments are prone to false positives and false negatives, which further disputes the APA's generalization. One scholar even wrote a public letter detailing his grievances and disagreement with their ideas. So, all in all, violent video games seem alright. At least for older audiences. See, there's one area we haven't talked about yet. Violent video games for toddlers and young children. While adults and even teenagers can handle more intense video game experiences, and as we talked about, may even use violent video games as an outlet for their aggression, with young children, it's an entirely different story. Kids at this age are very, very impressionable and could very easily become desensitized to death and pain through constant exposure. It's kind of like when a child hears a swear word and decides to try them out himself. While the exposure isn't always entirely realistic, such as Fortnite, it opens their minds up to the idea of hurting, or even killing. And while this by no means that they might kill someone, it might subconsciously open them up to a potential for violence. Plus, gory or violent video games can simply be too much stimulation for a young child. They might even be scared or upset by such games, sometimes to the extent that they might lose sleep over it. While I approve of violent video games for teens and adults, I cannot stress enough how mentally damaging violent video games as children can be. It's something that young children just can't possibly understand. It's one thing to watch violence in cartoons and movies, but taking an active role in the violence is a whole different story. Children can be quite sensitive after all. The most important takeaway here is to know what children can handle. Of course, each child is different and will have a different reaction to violent video games than the next. The goal is to create an enjoyable gameplay experience for children, not to terrify them or even deprive them of experiences either. In my opinion, violence is just something that should be saved until the child has the maturity to deal with it properly. But there's one more important area that we need to talk about. Use of violence in video games as artful expression. While a video game is certainly not a book or painting, it is a form of art all on its own. That being said, some developers use violence to convey a message or story, and sometimes even to evoke emotion, rather than to desensitize the player. Take Insurgency Sandstorm, for instance, which provides one of the most realistic depictions of war that you'll find in a video game. Its point is not to desensitize, it's to convey an accurate image of something that's truly horrifying. Why? For the same reason that people write books about terrible things like murder, war, and crime. To inform others about this tragedy, to vent about their own personal experiences, or to offer understanding to those who have no experiences with the source material. Every detail is present in that game, from accurate gun anatomy to rough language to realistic blood and gore. And while, of course, like I stated before, a child should surely not be playing a game like this, a teen or adult with enough maturity to handle such a concept could find playing Insurgency Sandstorm a harrowing or mind-opening experience. There's one other game I'd like to give an honorable mention in this department, and that's a game called Ready or Not, a spiritual successor to the SWAT games. This game is still in development, and there's not a lot to say about it besides sifting through developer notes, but there is still significant impact here. Not only does this game strive to make the most realistic war experience possible, with realistic blood physics and lowered performance based on damage to different parts of your body, but it strives to create emotion. It even says, and I quote, "Deaths need to be impactful to the end user," in regards to the very detailed gore and graphics. In fact, the game as a whole does not provide murder as a goal. From what we can see in this early stage, it appears to have more hostage rescue situations as goals than actual violence, meaning the player could theoretically play the game with little to no killings. That is the emotionally evocative experience that this game strives to make, and can only make with the heavy use of violence. So, what's the overall takeaway? Well, the answer is no. Violent video games do not create lasting aggression in most people. This conclusion is contradictory to both the APA's public statement and many studies, but not without a good reason, as video game research is very prone to bias and false conclusions. Sometimes video game designers can use violence to evoke emotion rather than to desensitize, or to create a more realistic, simulation-like experience in their game. After all, video games are a form of art. With toddlers and younger children, there's a whole different story, because violent video games can not only be very intense for younger players, but very formative and influential in such an impressionable period of life. Personally, I would strongly advocate against violent video games for younger children. The most important thing is that video games are both appropriate and enjoyable. Whether it's enjoyable because it opens your eyes, because it gives you insight into an unfamiliar experience, or because it's just mindless fun. And with that, remember, we didn't start the fire, we just keep it burning. Thanks for watching and have a happy new year. I've never been a huge fan of violent games myself, which made this video all the more interesting to write, as I had somewhat of an outsider's point of view. A link to Ready or Not's development page is in the description, as well as the Psychology Today article I used, which has many external links as well. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I hope you feel I handled this tender subject well. Thanks for watching.